Hello, everyone, and this is going to be my first of possibly many online Bible studies. There go my glasses again, going crooked. Anyways, we're going to do John's Gospel. For those of you who have attended my Bible studies before, you know how much I enjoy questions. I don't know how it works. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to be an expert by the end of this. Anyways, we're going to do John's Gospel because I think everybody loves John's Gospel. I think it's one of the misunderstood Gospels. So this will also be posted, by the way, afterwards on YouTube. So if you're interested in following YouTube, that would be great as well. So again, if you have any questions, type them in and I'll do my best to figure out how this works. Anyways, I'm going to start by saying that a little cute story, and I know that some of you older people like me will enjoy this. I was dusted off my old John copy from Regent, and it's a tape series I did with Ricky Watts, one of the professors there, and it happened that I was putting one of these into my now obsolete machine, and my daughter came down and said, "What's that?" And she had no idea what this was. So anyways, it was an interesting experience. So I'm going to teach about John's Gospel, and why don't we get right into it? I'm using the NRSV, and I'm hoping that you will find this illuminating, and that people, whenever you want to watch it, when you're in quarantine, you can come alongside. I don't want to preach. This is not a preaching time. I hope that everybody here takes the time to get as much out of this as they can, and feel free to ask questions and disagree with me if you want. Anyways, so we start off with John 1, and it's hugely important how you begin a gospel. The Gospels were written in a certain way that we don't write things today. The Gospel of John was written, and it starts in the beginning. And we know immediately he's referring to something, don't we? We know that he's referring to the creation story, in the beginning. And every gospel, you only understand that gospel through the prologue. That's how they wrote things. Aristotle said in the ancient world, he talked about books, you cannot understand a book unless you understand the beginning of the book. So, if you take Mark's gospel, he starts with Isaiah, and he emphasizes Isaiah throughout the whole thing. If you take Luke, he emphasizes King David, and you're going to see a very thematic Jesus as a King David figure. Moses' figure in Matthew, you see that again when you see this king that kills the innocents. You see the family fleeing Egypt. You see Jesus coming. He goes and gets baptized. It's like crossing the Red Sea. Then he's tempted for 40 days, not 40 years. You see that same theme as in the Exodus. And then he goes and gives a new law, just like Moses did on the Mount. You see these themes. Well, in John's Gospel, we start in the beginning. And in the beginning is for an ancient world, was not a way of describing how things happened, how things came to be. The creation stories, and we know a lot about them now, were not designed as a mechanistic means of explaining the material world. That's just not how they were designed. They didn't care about the brick and mortar, in other words. They were concerned about the meaning of what came to be. So when you understand that, you understand that when John is emphasizing the word becoming flesh here, when he's starting about in the beginning, he's talking about where did we come from? What are we about? And that's what he wants to emphasize. What is humanity about, and what is God about? Because that's what the creation story is ultimately about. And every creation story was different. In the ancient world, you had the pagan creation stories where humanity was created out of demons, the blood of demons, and you had them slaves in the garden. And you can see how that story of their origins impacted their culture, because it was easy to make them slaves. They were created to be slaves. And you could see how they were less than human because they had this demonic, if you would, or this lesser God emphasis. All right. in the creation story, we have God creating in the garden humanity and asking and creating them to bear his image in the garden. And so humanity is actually given a high level, but something goes wrong. We know that. They try and be like God. They know by knowing good from evil. And you see this destructiveness happening in humanity after that. And you see the judgment. Well, in John's gospel, we're now going to see the cure, if I can say that. It's going to be where we've been, and it's telling a story about ultimately who God is and who humanity is. And ironically, for the first reader, that same God is going to become truly human. That's how this will be dealt with in John's gospel. And you're going to see a lot of symbolism, light and dark. You're going to see these emphasized again and again in John's gospel because they come out of the creation narrative. All right? So he starts off, in the beginning was the Word. This Word, there were three ways that God in the Jewish world could interact with humanity. See, God was so transcendent. His glory was so great. He could not be seen. We even know with Moses, he wants to look upon him, but he could only look at his back because you'd be killed. So there were three ways that you would interact with, that God would interact with humanity. Number one was the wisdom, the Sophia of God. You see this in Proverbs, where wisdom is given a godlike character as the creator. The second way that you would speak about God interacting was pneuma, the spirit. And that would happen like when the spirit hovers over creation. And then the third way was the word, the logos. Now, some people have thought that this was John trying to reach out to the Greeks, because the Greeks also had this understanding of logos as God, but it was not the same as the Jews. It was a very philosophical idea. This was a Jewish understanding of God. And so when he said in the beginning was the Word, the Jews would be fine with this. They would have no trouble. The first century, Second Temple Jews would say, yeah, great. Yeah, in the beginning was the Word. Yep, okay. And the Word was with God. They would have no trouble. Where they are going to have trouble is when he says the Word was God. Because in this point, he's going to begin to explain the Word in very real physical terms. And they did not hold that. That was not a first century Second Temple view. So this is also controversial, but John doesn't seem to care. And he was in the beginning with God. This idea is, the picture is that this Word is without time. He exists. This language of in the beginning is eternal. And he goes, all things were made through him. So now this Word, this mysterious Word, is now being put in the creator mold. He's now Yahweh. He's now Elohim. He's the picture of the creator God. And with him was not anything made that was made. And without him was not anything made that was made. In other words, he was a part of this whole concept of creation. In him, it says, was life. This language is of Zoe, this abundant life that John's going to continue. But he's also pointing back to life that was given to the created world. In him comes life. This is a fascinating thing. And the life was the light of men. This idea of light is here's revelation of knowing who we truly are meant to be. This is who this creator was. And then he stops and he says, the light shines in darkness. This is important because there's already an understanding that because of this break between humanity and God, that there is darkness. And we see this in the world. We see in the world that there has always been injustice. There's always been dehumanizing behavior. This is not a new concept. As far as you can look back in history, whatever culture, whatever tribe, there's a darkness that comes. It's a way of being less than human. That's how John would have understood that. But this light dominates the darkness. It doesn't get overwhelmed. It dominates it. The darkness shall not overcome it. How wonderful is that in times like today? when we're seeing people do such insane things like licking toilet seats to prove they are better than coronavirus. I mean, you see these dehumanizing behaviors, the selfishness of people. I understand the anger, but it's not new. But the good news in John's gospel is it doesn't win. Do you see? That's John's gospel to those people in that first century world that were being persecuted and killed for believing in Jesus Christ. This light will not be put out. And John needs you to understand this, early Christian, because it must have been tempting, just like today, to think that the darkness wins. But this is his point. This word is ultimately going to win. He switches gears now from the philosophical view of God, of this word, of this creator, and he brings in the historical reality. And this is something we should understand right now about John's gospel. It's misunderstood that it's a spiritual gospel. This is not just a spiritual gospel. This is a gospel that is as historical as any of the others. It is written differently, for sure. What they call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are seemingly more written as a biography as we understand it. John's gospel will take us into great philosophical ideas with long lectures of Jesus, but we know that it has so many points of historical connection, and he wants us to understand that this word is not an idea like the Greeks held. This was a word that existed in flesh and blood and around people of flesh and blood. That's why he draws John in immediately. So there was a man sent from God whose name was John. So right away we see, and this is not unusual, the prophets all were sent by God in the sense of they had a commission. That's what that sending means. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light. He came to speak about what it means to be truly human. We know this. He came around, he talked about repenting from behavior. That's something we don't like in our culture anymore, is this concept of repentance, that there is a light and a darkness. But for John's gospel, I'm telling you right now, if we're going through this, you're going to be shocked at how much John is a dualistic gospel, in the sense of there is a right and a wrong, and you have a choice in your life, and this has consequences. And so when John comes in, he comes to bear witness to the light. Remember, again and again, the light is about revelation. That darkness is about being blind. And you're going to see this happen again and again. The picture you're going to see, like take Nicodemus. Nicodemus is going to come and says, in the dark night, at the absolute blackest. And we see with Nicodemus, a historical figure, by the way, that we can point back to in the first century, that he, in that interaction with Jesus, does not get it. He just doesn't get it. He's blinded by the light. Then a chapter later, we're at the Syrophoenician woman by the well, and it's the heat of the day. It's the lightest light. And of course, she has a revelation. So you're seeing these points in John's gospel again and again. And that's what you look for, is these themes from creation right through the gospel. And I'm hoping that that will help us to understand. And what is so wonderful about John's gospel is I'm taking you into the deep end of the pool. You and I can read this as a child and get so much out of it. That's why people love this gospel. He was a witness to bear witness about the light. He wasn't the light. That's very important, because in the first century, they're going to be very confused about what John's role is. There's clearly disciples of John and Jesus at the same time. Paul encounters John's disciples. They haven't even heard of Jesus. So clearly, this is something that John has to work out for that early church. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through the word. Not through John, through the word. All right. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Notice he says that twice. This is really important, that the locus of this truism of humanity is not in John. And that's an important point, because John is fallible. We see that. He doubts. In fact, I don't think he really understands Jesus' messiahship in the end. He's looking for that kind of Messiah, that first century Messiah that Jews look for. He was waiting for him to be delivered when he was in the prison, Herod's prison. And Jesus has to say to him, I'm not kind of the Messiah that you're looking for. And he even goes to his death following this God that he really didn't understand completely. And you can't blame him. Who would have? He goes back now. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. This light, this truth, is not a set of philosophical ideas. That's so important about what it means to be human. The Greeks looked at creation as a system, and we're very much going back to that with our story about how things came to be. People talk now, and they only talk about mechanism, don't they? They talk about it as if the world is only about how do we come together, how we're formed. We're just a bunch of molecules that come together. And by the way, that affects how you live, just like the ancient world. If you tell everybody that they were created to be slaves, then people are going to see themselves as slaves. If you tell people that all they were created to be mechanistic forces that came together and they're just cosmic goo, they're going to act like cosmic forces that came together like goo, and pretty soon they're going to be licking toilet seats for coronavirus. It's honestly, it's how these things come together. Well, for Paul, the true light is a person. Or sorry, John. I've been preaching on Paul. Got to get back to John. John, the true light is a human being. It is not a set of ideas. That's so important today that we say as Christians, not get in arguments about the mechanistic way of the creation, but to talk about what does it mean to be human. That's what this is all about. And who was the creator is telling us what that is. Well, now we get this exegesis, this exposition of God. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. The world is in darkness. When he comes in, we see that, obviously, with Herod. We see that the strangest people are the ones that even have a hint, that being those wise men, which were really magi, which were really pagan worshipers. They're the ones that kind of get it, but nobody really gets it. And he comes into this world. So the picture is the creator is good, but the world is broken. That's an important thing too, because the world was created good, but it's broken. And John's gospel is all about recreation. It's not about throwing it out. It's about renewing it. All right. The world did not know him. He came to his own. Now here he's speaking in particular about the people of God, Israel. And of course, that was what he first came to. It says very clearly that his message was first to Israel, because Israel's commission was always to the world, to be priests. At this time, they hate the world. The world has been persecuting them. And on a national level, I'm not saying every Jew in that time, but the large majority wanted to destroy pagans and were longing for that. He comes to his own, and his own people do not receive him, and we also see that. And when he's talking about that, he's not talking about every Jew, because we know that Peter and John and Matthew, they will follow him to a degree, as long as he's that kind of Messiah. But the key point is the leaders do not receive this light. They are dehumanized, just like the pagans. That was hard to hear for a first century Jew. But to all who did receive him, and here's John's gospel of his in and out. He's such a black and white thinker. For all those who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. This everyone is really everyone. There isn't like a few, and I'm sorry to my Calvinist friends, there's not a limited supply. This meant everybody. This option in John's gospel was not limited by something called the elect. This was all people everywhere were given this option. Now, the question about election, we can get into that another day. But the point being, everyone's welcome. That was hard to hear for a first century Jew, because they knew they were in and the other guys were out. But this is where John's gospel is global. And that's why it's such a global, wonderful story. Is he saying today, just like today, then whoever believes in his name, they get to be children automatically. And that's just a wonderful truth. And I think that's why John's gospel is so promoted in all denominations. It's just such a wonderful truism that there's the promise. Now, on the other side in John's gospel is for those who don't believe, there's clearly a warning. And that you can't lose. And Some people in our culture don't like that. I'm just warning you, when we get to this, John doesn't have a view of a modern, nice Canadian. He is dealing with a gospel that he sees as urgently to be believed, and he expects people to grasp it. All right. And now he says, who have the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood. Right away, he's pointing to the Jews at that point. They believed that because of their bloodline inheritance, they had become children of God, that they were sons of Abraham. We know the early church blew that up and said that children of Abraham were those who believed by faith. Okay, so we became Israel, not a national. So God in Jesus has no longer become a tribal God. He's blown that up, and now everyone can come in. Bloodline doesn't matter. Nor the will of the flesh. This is our desires. We don't have the ability within ourselves, within John's gospel, to pull this off. This is a God move. He is coming into this world, and he is going to make himself revealed. And we are not accepted because we come up with the right thoughts or the right moral expectancy or the right spirituality. We come in because we accept the light. The revelation is presented before us of what it means to be human, and then we go to it. Nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man. So there's no will of man, but of God. This is all a God move, and that's hard for our pride. Go back to the creation story. You can be like God, knowing good from evil. This is the fall, and it goes on and on. We don't like the idea that somebody comes to save us. Think of the times when we've been offered charity. That is something we just don't like. It goes against everything within us because we want to be self-sufficient, especially in the West. Anyways, and then he goes on and says, and the word became flesh. He became embodied. This is a debate that's going to go on in the church for years. Was Jesus truly human? Was he just God? In the docetic view of, God he was kind of there looking human, but he was just really God. Or the other ones, the adoptionists that say, well, he was a really good human, so God gave him a little extra. Neither of those are true in John's gospel. And the truth is, he's fully human and he's fully God. And that's what this says. The word became flesh. And by becoming flesh, it says something about humanity, doesn't it? It says that God's not somewhere off in the distance. He has decided that we're so vitally important to his character that he's going to embody us. It's an incredible proclamation today and then. We've seen his glory as the only Son. He's the only Son. The wording here in Greek is more like the ultimate Son. There isn't another one that's kind of around the corner going to come. He's it. He's the one that brings the glory. And of course, the glory in John's gospel just undoes everything because the glory is found on the cross. It's the sacrificial nature of this character of God that's just so incredible. From the Father, full of grace and truth. These are two things in John's gospel that you're always going to see bumping together. Grace, absolutely. Unmerited favor. You see that again and again. The woman at the well. You see it again as he reaches out to Nicodemus. You see it again with the blind man, again and again and again. But there's also truth. This is something we have trouble with in our culture, and we certainly have trouble with this in the church. We love grace, maybe not so much truth. Truth is that there is a way to be human. He's bringing that in, that there is a way to be sacrificial. And boy, in these times like today, the news is, we know inherently, we'll watch the news as they're talking about these people meeting on beaches and partying in pubs and the selfishness. We know deep in our heart that there's untruth going on. There's dehumanizing behavior. John has no trouble with that. Though there's grace, there's truth. There's way to be human. I remember a gentleman, he told me once that he was a former guy of a leader of a church, and he had slept around on his wife on the internet a few times, and he eventually, I asked him, like, how do you do that? And he goes, well, I'm saved by grace. I'm saved by grace. He didn't want the truth. But Jesus, the one who is the one who brings this glory is, and who is this Son from the Father, is one who brings grace and truth. Again, he flips back to John. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This is whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me." Remember, John's gospel is written to a place where people are longing to know who is John and who is Jesus. And who is Jesus and who is John the Baptist? He's got to emphasize this again and again. This was he of whom I said. This is the one he's pointing to. So that's all in John's gospel the disciples do, is point away from themselves. I wonder if we in the church could learn that. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. This is such a wonderful explanation that we, because of him becoming human, we just feel grace and grace. It's a continuous thing. It doesn't just happen once because we're still broken. It happens again and again and again up until we enter glory. Then he goes back, for the law was given through Moses. You see this, that there was a style of revelation that was changed when the word came in. And we see this, the church wrestling with this, all those early Jews who had been raised that Torah was the whole ultimate way of being human. Jesus doesn't, if it's people or the law, people first. And so we see in the early church, how much of the law do we keep? And that's mostly what Paul's letters are written about, which were actually before John's gospel, by the way. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Isn't that interesting? He plays off the law with Jesus Christ here. And I think that's fascinating because ultimately the law was pointing to being human, and Jesus was the true human. He was the light. He was the life. No one has ever seen God. That's a typical Jewish view. God could only be known through those intermediaries, spirit wisdom, and word. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. This is the incredible thing, that he has become the exegesis. That's the word, the teaching of God amongst us. That's what Christianity is about. I'm going to stop there. We've gone almost a half hour. What I would want to say to you, to remember John's prologue is saying that the Creator God became human, and he shows how much he values humanity. The God of the creation narrative has come in to his garden, but the garden's full of weeds, isn't it? It's darkness. It doesn't understand it. But he's come to bring that light. He's come to bring the weed whacker. It's interesting that we're going to find in John's gospel, and I'm going to leave you with a little nugget as we go forward. This God become human. By the way, when somebody asks you about, do you believe in God, say which one? Because there's so many out there. Ours is particular. It is in Jesus Christ. That's the revelation. Anything outside of that, we can only speculate. He is what we see. So if you like Jesus, you like God. You don't like Jesus, you don't like God. That's it. I want to end up with this. It's fascinating that in the resurrection narrative, and I invite you to go to it, I think it's chapter 19, it's in the garden that his tomb is. That you see this imagery of the creation. He runs into Mary, only one in this story, which makes sense because he's going to call her woman, just like the Eve story. And who is he thought to be? A gardener. What was Adam's called to be? A gardener, to till the soil and take care of the earth. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. I hope this was useful. I hope this helps you get through a half hour in quarantine. I'll do the rest. I think we'll do 19 to 28 on Wednesday. Be safe, be well, walk your dogs, but be safe and keep that distance and wash those hands. All right, have a great day.